I'm standing here in front of Lafayette Cemetery number 1, the closest cemetery to my home. It is a somber, sad time in our country and in New Orleans, with so many people that have unfortunately died in this epidemic that we're experiencing. And unfortunately also in New Orleans, this is not the first time that we've gone through such unfortunate circumstances. And we are also unable to do our traditional mourning with funerals, second lines in New Orleans. And that is also a great cause of distress and is highly unfortunate, as without that we have little closure, as we are used to such cultural exercises to say goodbye to those that mean so much to us. Hopefully, as this begins to improve, we can go back and have some of those rites and traditions to give those that have gone a proper farewell and a goodbye.
Welcome to NOLA, gent. Let the good times roll. New Orleans is famous or infamous for its cemeteries. And driving into or out of the city, you can't help but notice the distinctive sight of the tombs as you pass by some of the 45 burial grounds that are in the area. Samuel Clemens, also known as Mark Twain, in his memoir, Life on the Mississippi, reflected on the burial practices of New Orleans when he wrote, "They bury their dead in vaults, above the ground. These vaults have a resemblance to houses, sometimes to temples, are built of marble, generally are architecturally graceful and shapely. They face the walks and driveways of the cemetery, and when one moves through the midst of 1,000 or so of them and sees their white roofs and gables stretching to the distance on every hand, the phrase City of the Dead has all at once a meaning to him." Epidemics in the past certainly helped to build these cities of the dead in New Orleans, and death from disease and many other causes still continues to do so. More than 41,000 people died from yellow fever in New Orleans between the years 1817, the first year with reliable statistics, and the last outbreak in 1905. In an epidemic year, the mortality rate could reach as high as 60% of those who contracted the disease. The death rate in New Orleans ranged from a low of 36 per 1,000 in the late 1820s to a high of 1 in 15 during the summer of 1853. In 1853, it is estimated that 8,000 to 12,000 people died of yellow fever just in New Orleans that year, with more certainly dying outside the city. Cholera, smallpox, and malaria also claimed more lives during this period. So currently, due to the pandemic, many of the New Orleans area cemeteries are currently closed, but there are many others that are open to walk through and many other ones that you can drive through rather easily. I'm not going to be mentioning most of the cemetery specific names, as this video will focus mainly on the overall general history of cemeteries in New Orleans. Now, this is Lafayette Cemetery number 1, which is popular with tourists but currently closed, whereas this is Lafayette Cemetery number 2, a little further up the street on Washington, which is not that popular with tourists, but it is currently open. This video will also debunk the frequently repeated story that underground burials in New Orleans are not possible due to the high water table, and that is why we have the raised tombs, which is demonstrably false. Now, that is in no way to dispute the fact that occasionally during floods and other high water events that sometimes coffins do pop out of the ground or otherwise out of their vaults. But that is not in dispute, as it happens other places besides New Orleans and Louisiana whenever there are similar events. We can prove demonstrably, though, that from the beginning until the current times there have been and there still are below ground burials. St. Peter Cemetery was New Orleans' first public burial site, which opened in 1723.
So behind me is St. Peter Cemetery, the first cemetery in New Orleans. So this entire block between Toulouse and St. Peter's was the graveyard.
Bounded by St. Peter, North Rampart, Toulouse and Burgundy streets, all of these burials were underground, and many still remain there under our contemporary French Quarter buildings, as recent excavations in 2010 discovered. It should be noted that during the initial French domain over New Orleans, and for some time during Spanish rule, bodies continued to be buried underground. It wasn't until the late 1780s that this burial practice changed. It was not because of the high water table causing bodies to pop out of the ground, or flooding sending caskets everywhere, or any other reasons related to underground burials being impossible, as so many mistakenly claim. One big reason for the change is that the city was quickly growing, and the St. Peter Cemetery was completely full. The cemetery had run out of space as the underground burials took up more room than the use of above-ground tombs, which had already been in use around the Mediterranean for centuries. And you can see raised tombs and mausoleums all over Europe that look very similar to the New Orleans versions. After the Great Fire of 1788 in New Orleans, which destroyed 856 structures out of 1,100, Spanish governor of Louisiana Esteban Miro and Intendant Martin Navarro took immediate steps to help the homeless and hungry and to rebuild the city. While only one person died as a result of the fire, the city still needed a new cemetery. It was in 1789 that city officials established St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 outside the original city walls. The first Protestant cemetery in New Orleans was the old Girard Street Cemetery, which was founded in 1822 and was also known as the American Cemetery, as it was used by newcomers to the city who were not of the original French and Spanish Creole and largely Catholic background of the long-term colonists who were the original inhabitants of the city. This cemetery was also heavily utilized as a public burying ground in times of epidemic. It seems as though nearly every major epidemic of the 19th century involved a terrible disaster at Girard Street Cemetery, in which bodies were stacked beyond capacity with no one to bury them. This may have also been due to the presence of a de facto potter's field adjoining the cemetery. The cemetery was constantly plagued from its founding with flooding just from the rain, and this issue led to its recommended closure in 1880, but the recommendation was ignored, and the cemetery continued to deteriorate until the point in the mid-1930s people started to use newer, better-kept cemeteries in the area, which finally led to the closure of the cemetery in 1940, and it remained empty and derelict until it was officially torn down on January 4th, 1957. Through the course of demolition, human remains of white people were moved to Hope Mausoleum, and those of black people were moved to Providence Memorial Park. Where the old Girard Street Cemetery once stood is now where the Superdome parking garages and the Champion Square complex now rest. And almost certainly there are still graves remaining underneath. So if you see these underground burials in the video right now that have a slightly raised mound of earth surrounded by concrete, these are known as copings. Here's an example of a coping with even more soil on top, which would even further raise the burial level with more soil on top of it. There's also an economic differential between the larger mausoleum tombs and the underground burials, along with cultural and religious differences. And looking back at the video, here are some examples of just complete underground burials with no coping. The other main types of graves that we see in the New Orleans area are family tombs, which are large mausoleums or small mausoleums, made just for family. As you can see examples of those in the video right here. And then society tombs, which are typically the larger mausoleums, which are for organizations, groups, benevolent societies that would be for members of that group and their families to be in. And then we have the wall vaults, which originally were designed to be temporary. As in the raised tombs, the minimum amount of time a body typically is allowed to be in there is a year and a day, and that is seen to give enough time for the body to decompose enough to then remove the coffin and the human remains, put those remains either in a bag or just push the remains to the back of the tomb, which then has a space to let those bones fall underneath, to a little space underneath there, and then the next body can be put in or have the next remains put in and pushed to the back, which will then fall to the bottom. Sadly, vandalism and theft are common occurrences at the cemeteries. Some thieves steal the copper screws that fasten the faceplates to the tombs to sell as scrap metal. When the screws are removed, the marble plates, many of which are more than a century old with intricate carvings, often fall and break. Grave robbers also steal statues, vases, and sometimes even the wrought iron fences that surround some of the graves. The Times-Picayune, reporting on their website, NOLA.com, reported that the tomb of Voodoo Queen Marie Laveau in St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 was vandalized by being painted pink. In 2014, the story of unlicensed tour guides who were opening tombs and removing body remains was reported again by the Times-Picayune. In 2015, vaults in Lafayette Cemetery No. 2 were reported broken into with the remains exposed by the Times-Picayune again. And then in 2016, a witch was arrested for selling human body parts acquired from the New Orleans Holt Cemetery. So now we're here at Holt Cemetery, where nearly all of the graves are underground. That cemetery is a Pottersville cemetery where nearly all of the bodies are buried below ground, as is the Charity Hospital Cemetery on Canal Street, which is also all below ground burials. So these are just a few examples of the many abuses by both locals and tourists alike of the cemeteries of New Orleans. Many of the unlicensed tour guides are also not locals and will frequently give very inaccurate information or simply just make things up for their tours, in addition to those that have been destructive to the cemeteries and other areas of the city. These problems have led to some of the graveyards being closed to the public unless they are escorted by an officially licensed tour guide. The best and safest group to book your cemetery tours with is the organization Save Our Cemeteries, as their entire purpose is to preserve and restore unique cemeteries in New Orleans. And I've posted a link below to their website, which is saveourcemeteries.org. They are a non-profit and they work really hard keeping our cemeteries up. So then we also have our Jewish cemeteries, and they are also all underground burials. So as we have seen with the many examples of underground burials in multiple graveyards in New Orleans, this clearly demonstrates that the above ground tomb vaults in New Orleans are used more due to culture, with French and Spanish burial traditions that were adopted by those who moved into the city as a demonstration of status, and for economy, where you could have multiple burials on one piece of land, where before they would just have to stack bodies under the ground, but they had limited space to do that, than because of any water table concerns or bodies floating away. As we can appreciate, all of these graveyards are so beautiful in New Orleans. So culture, class, and religious practices all have an impact on people's choices to be buried above ground or underground. And cremation is as well becoming more common. So in the end, we know we all end up in a similar place to this. And just a moment of silence for all of those that we have lost and will lose. And as we know, we all shall join them soon enough. If you would like to follow me on Yelp, I have thousands of pictures and reviews on there. You can also follow me on Instagram for more photos. And please like this video and subscribe to the NOLA channel. We would also love it if you would help us out on Patreon and help the channel continue to have more content produced. Thank you very much.